Hi everybody, welcome to this bonus lesson here on the beauty of pastel. Today I am painting for you a sunset cloud image on a piece of Selenier Carte pastel card. If you have watched my videos for a while, or maybe you're just brand new, this is a paper that I just love. It's a really unique grit. It accepts pastel in a really interesting way, and if you haven't tried it, I have included a link below in this post to the paper that I'm using. The image is going to pop up over there on the left, and as usual, this is a gorgeous scene from West Texas as my husband was driving down the highway during this storm that was off in the distance. I was craning my neck all around and my camera trying to capture all the angles of these gorgeous clouds, and there's no filter on this picture at all. That is how it looked, of course, with my own eyes, even more beautiful, but I knew that I really wanted to paint this scene. I often take the photographs whenever I'm wanting to paint some clouds. I take that photograph with an extremely small horizon line way at the bottom. That really helps portray a more majestic sky if you leave a lot of the paper expanse for your sky and your clouds. I began the painting, of course, in the very beginning. It's kind of hard to see. I had just a mechanical pencil, a graphite, just a regular school pencil that my kids, I stole some after they got their school supplies this summer. And I love to sketch out my major shapes. In this case, I just outlined the clouds, and then I also outlined kind of some scrubby trees and the land at the bottom. And now my job is to fill in those major shapes with that soft pastel. I rarely, if ever, use pure white in a cloud painting. There's so many different colors, and especially in these. What I am seeing here and painting in this moment are the dark shadows of course, the major cloud that kind of reaches across and looks kind of dark blue. I'm also trying to form the shadow areas that right next to the very peach colored glowing aspect of the cloud. I'm also working with the blue color of the sky, cutting back in and creating shapes. This is negative painting where I'm kind of starting to carve, almost carving out of marble or carving out of the paper the shape that I want the clouds to be. Where there is basically open paper, no pastel. Of course, you can see me now starting to put in some of those peaches. Now, in this piece, I move a little quicker into putting in my highlight colors, mostly because I am working on Carte paper. And when you're working on Carte paper, you can't physically work on any kind of wet underpainting like I normally would if I were to work on UArt paper or Luxe Archival or even Pastel Matte, Color Fix. Lots of those sanded papers that can really handle kind of a wet scrubbing media, where I love to use watercolors sometimes or even alcohol washes. This paper does not accept any wet underpainting. It will dissolve the grit, which really makes it almost impossible to then lay pastel back onto the paper. So just be careful and plan ahead. If you want to create some kind of underpainting, I would suggest you use a different type of paper than this Carte paper. One thing that I really love about Carte is the effects you can get with glazing techniques, using hard and soft pastels, and really using very light scribbling marks. You can see that I have been doing that quite a bit, really using almost more of a pointed end of the pastel, which is something I don't often do necessarily with other types of papers. But this grit is very unique, like I've mentioned several times, and it will really layer very beautifully. And so this is something that I love about Carte. I feel like it helps me with my own mark making and just the practice of how the pastel lays on the paper. If all of your marks are similar, Maybe try to incorporate some different types of scumbling or stippling or hash marks or using the pointed end. Think of your pastels as brushes themselves, and your pastel paintings will become much more interesting. I'm especially right now working on the shift from that very, very bright blue right next to the main large peach section of that background cloud, kind of the main cloud. We have one that's hovering in front of it a little bit as well, but to me, that area is really important. And so I'm wanting to establish my colors and my values in that section, and then I'm going to kind of wind and circulate my way outward. I love to work like that in general. I like to kind of work almost from a focal point area or from a great area of interest, develop that, and then work my way out, getting looser and looser towards the edges. I love a loose painting. I love for the paper to really help just work for me. And in this case, choosing this kind of brownish color was warm in of itself, and so that warmth of the paper is going to peek through and help me create this warm cloud painting. I'm always kind of testing out value. You'll see that I have a very, very light general blue color on the very edges of this cloud. And right now it's looking quite messy. Of course, as we know, as pastelists, that there's always kind of a messy phase and you have to move through it. You have to have a plan, or at least know where you're going, or have a plan on where you want to end up. Sometimes it doesn't quite work that way, right? But I usually really try to use a very, very light touch, even on these very first marks. And then I can test it with my eyes. I step back, I go get a cup of coffee, I squint my eyes or even relax my vision to test to see if the color is pleasing to me. Then I can go back in with a harder touch or a more firm pressure to create more of an opaque feeling in the cloud and in the sky. My very loose marks right here, kind of scribbling in, that is a Townsend Tirage pastel that I love. I love these pastels. They have pumice in them, and you can even kind of hear how scratchy and wonderful they are. But as I'm putting this color down, I'm testing out, once again, I'm testing out the value in the color, and I love to step back. If you squint down, or you can even take a picture of your pastel at this point to test out your shapes and to see if you think the color has some rhythm and harmony in it. What maybe needs to be changed shape-wise, or if you need to make a small value adjustment. There is so much. Pastel has a lot of flexibility, and really, unless you lose grit on your paper or something major has happened, lots of things can be adjusted and fixed throughout the process. Putting in that blue, using a firmer touch here. Of course, pastel can be both transparent and an opaque medium depending on the pressure that you're using with your hand. If you find that you have a very heavy touch, I would suggest you start with harder pastels in the beginning because they are harder. They don't lay down quite as much pigment. Now, as I am working on really filling in the blue part of the sky, I'm also going to start refining the clouds, especially. And I really notice, especially in that one cloud that's kind of floating in front of the main cloud, is how close in value that color of that cloud is to the blue behind it. If you squint down, those edges are very lost. You can almost not see where the cloud ends and the sky begins. That's really hazy. And so that is an effect that I'm always looking at. Whenever I look at my paintings, I'm thinking, how far apart in value are these different subject matters? And that can be from rivers and grasses to trees and sky to clouds and sky, even rooftops and treetops. It really depends on the subject matter. If you really notice and look, turn your eyes on to really see the value relationships within the subject matter of your painting. It's always a little bit difficult when I'm painting a long, tall image because inevitably my shoulder gets in the way. I'm sorry about that. I was working on the lower part of the sky, trying to establish the light of the blue sky. Love to, of course, use a lighter value of blue as we go down towards the horizon. It's usually a little lighter and a little greener than the sky color above it. So I usually like to use some kind of turquoise, very light greens even. In this case, I'm also pulling out some of my really luscious, gorgeous coral pastels to start building the sunset as it's descending down into the land. You'll notice that I'm slowly starting to work a little bit smaller. I have my main cloud formation kind of blocked in, and then I'm starting to carve in smaller and smaller details to further refine this cloud image. Working big to small is really a great way to have a little bit of that negative painting as well, which is a really fun way to create shapes on your paper. I'm also starting to put in some other peaches around, making sure that I have some of that color represented in a different area as well. So that peach that I had just put into the main cloud, I put a tiny little bit of it down at the bottom as well, so that color can bounce around the page. Here you can see the glazing techniques that I'm using more of the tip and the pinpoint of the pastels, using a lot of that scribbling, kind of hash mark making. Think about the Degas paintings that I often talk about, of course, every pastelist idol, or most of us anyway, and how he layered color with all of his scribbly marks. It's fascinating to look at. And so I love that technique. Instead of blending everything with my fingers or even the foam that I use sometimes, that's another great way to blend, is with the pastels themselves. Now I'm going to start adding a little bit of that very dark foreground. There was kind of a little hill. Normally my pastel of clouds have just mostly flat land because I do live on the prairie. In this case, there was a slight little rise in the land. That nice dark foil against the lighter upper reaches of the sky will really help make this have a nice balance of darks and lights. I pulled back out that Townsend, and I'm using some short, choppy, chunky marks here. These pastels are great for that. This is cut in half or broken in half. I love to use broken halves of pastels because the broken edges can really make some interesting marks. Softening a little bit with my finger, still just working on building these layers up. this tiny little part of the painting I work on quite a bit and will continue to. I really love how the sky is glowing right as it's coming up right behind that dark bank of distant cloud. And so layering and blending these colors together using a lot of these scribbling techniques is going to help get me there. There are those opaque marks. I had the transparency of those early scribbles, kind of testing out that value. Finally decided, yes, that's the one I want to use. And so I put in a thicker, heavier mark to cover up some of that paper color. I could have also used a blending tool to kind of blend those together. Now, one thing about blending tools and on Carte especially, the Carte grit is made out of vegetable fiber, and so it's kind of this loose, grainy texture. It's not a glued on, sanded texture like, say, UArt. For that reason, since it's kind of loose, whenever you apply the pastel, some of the grit can actually come off. And even if you tap it with your fingers, you'll feel a little bit of it loosen onto your fingers. So in that aspect, sometimes if you use too many blending tools, or if you take a natural bristle brush after the pastel, it can knock off some of this grit. So it is a delicate paper, although it's a wonderful paper, and I highly recommend that you try it. I'm working a little bit on adding a glint of light to the upper area of that cloud. Although this shape is going to change very shortly, I decide that I want to kind of take off that pointy part of that cloud. So what do? I pull out my blue pastel and I can cut right into it and over it. Whenever you use a light touch and you have a lot of tooth left, it leaves a lot of room to really change the shapes that you have happening on your support. And here I am adjusting that shape using some scribbling marks, once again glazing the pastel over that peach section to just reshape the cloud a little bit. Not necessarily knocking off the pastel. I have plenty of tooth left. There's still a slight glow behind the pastel or behind the blue that peach is kind of informing it and making more of a yellow area of the sky, but that's something that I can easily fix as I keep going. Now here I have a lighter value of a neutral-ish purple. This isn't a very brilliant purple, it's a grade purple. And I'm applying it as almost a bridge or mid value between the peaches and the very dark base of that Townsend that I used. I felt like I needed almost a third value in there. I'm also going to pull out my Pen Pastel applicator to help me soften some edges. This is a really nice soft applicator. It works really well on Carte, especially because it doesn't knock off too much grit. It's a little softer maybe than the pipe foam or the gap filler foam that I like to use. blending some edges, creating a softer hazy effect, pushing it into the paper a little bit, especially if you want to cover up some of the texture. I added a swipe of warmer green at the base and also filled in the lower area of the horizon with some of that Townsend blue to indicate low-lying clouds, ones that are very, very far off in the distance. I also did blend that in with some of the Pastel applicator. Here's another use of that Pastel applicator. I want the sky to seem as if it's behind the darker foreground, and so loosening and really softening those values between will help with that effect. Now that I have the values that are really soft between the sky and the land, I can then go back in and further define and refine those shapes, adding a little bit of warmth, wanting this to be really loose and kind of not necessarily trying to make it look like a certain type of tree or even a certain type of grass, but just that there is land below. That dark value here, I added some charcoal, pulling and pushing that in to really create that nice sense of sunset. I love a dark foreground, especially one like this. Really helps make everything else just seem a little bit brighter and lighter up in the sky. One thing that I really like to do, not only with my sky paintings, but also any paintings with trees, is to have the subject matter expand off of the page. And so I pulled out some Mars Violet to change the shape of the smaller cloud that's in front of the main cloud. That way the clouds have a little bit more reach and it doesn't isolate a certain color, in this case the blue of the sky. It doesn't create this really strong color at the very tip top of the painting, which might pull the eye away from where I want the viewers to be, which of course is more the lower area of this painting. I also employ this technique of extending subject matter off of a page when I'm painting trees. If you have some trees that are almost at the top of your page, maybe extend them up a little bit. Expand the viewer's vision of what your painting is capturing. I love these final marks of a sunset piece, carving in and around and creating some fun little distant cloud effects with the pastels. Finalizing some shapes, really looking and stepping away to see if the shapes I have are interesting and different across the whole piece itself. Tapping with my fingers to maybe to soften an edge or two. Using the Pastel applicator to push that pastel into the paper, and then also added a little bit of charcoal to darken it once again. And then I love these little chunky marks right here, using quite a bit of pressure to get that glint of light off in the distance. I hope you enjoyed watching that pastel come to life. It was so much fun to paint. It's always fun to teach you new techniques, and I hope you learned something. If you did, please give this video a like. I would love it if you would subscribe to my channel and hit that little notification bell so you can know when a new video comes available. If you'd also like to help support this content coming out, every little bit helps. I would love it if you would consider visiting my Patreon page. The link is right here. Thank you so much for considering it. Thank you for spending your time with me today, and I will see you around.